Today we are joined by two a very interesting team. Rock and roll, I think, would be the apt word to use. One economist and one historian. One best-selling historian of the Roman times, and one economist who is, and I'm an economist as well. So, an economist who has actually thought long and hard about the periphery, something that economists are not really known for doing much these days. It's all about whatever is the newest thing that comes up in the market. We are trying to understand it and how good or bad it's going to be for the humanity. So first and foremost, welcome to the both of you to Sense Maker. And second, this is a very interesting conversation because when I picked your book, when it had just come out, the India edition is slightly different cover design than the one that you can pick up abroad. But when the book had just come out, it was an interesting what if, right? Donald Trump was in the past. Most of the pressing issues had been solved. We are having this conversation a fortnight after Mr. Trump, or rather, because it's a very, very long time. So almost a month now that Mr. Trump is now back in power. So there are quite a lot of things and a lot of ground that we have to cover. But I would begin by asking both of you, what is the West that the book talks about? Rome, America, and the future of the West. Because the West in the book is a very long and an extended, both a geographical identity, but also an economic identity.
I'll have a first go and then John can come in. I think it's also a kind of cultural identity because we argue very firmly at the back end of the book that the West has been associated with Europe and America, North America, but that this is actually much too restrictive an idea, and that if it's going to have a future, and Donald Trump notwithstanding, bless him, it may still have a future, that it would need to encompass a lot of societies that share some key values, like the rule of law and democracy. So absolutely plenty of Asian, plenty of African countries, and that it needs to cease to be, in fact, this kind of slightly hegemonic Western hemispheric concept, and needs to become a much more equal club of populations that understand themselves to share certain values in common, and that these values actually make for a better life for most people. So, I mean, crikey, I do feel kind of utopian even saying that at the current moment, but all things pass, so I haven't yet given up hope. But I think we see the West as a historical progression. Is that right, John? And that if it's going to really work, it needs to keep progressing, and it needs to become more encompassing.
Yeah, it has to be open to change, and I think that's what those who speak at the moment most loudly about the West and keeping alive Western culture and Western ideals want to, in a sense, not only stop the clock, but probably turn it back. I mean, if in its original existence, I mean, the West, I mean, if one wants to go right back to the very earliest roots, you would say, well, Western Europe, which would loosely correspond, and this is the kind of framework that Samuel Huntington once hit upon, that the Western, which would be Catholic originally, and then Catholic and Protestant, and the fault line there is with the East, with Orthodoxy. And as it happens, those are the areas where we get the earliest emergence of what we're calling a capitalist economy, but not right across Western Europe. But then, of course, it spreads outwards. And in the first instance, there are the colonial offshoots, the settler colonies of North America, of the Antipodes. But of course, pockets of settler activity elsewhere, and then significant colonization, which doesn't involve settlement on a large scale, including in places like India, in much of Africa. And this all, as Peter says, what we argue is, there is a core in this imperial economic system, and there's a periphery. But over time, the periphery, it more increasingly begins to, as its own development takes place, increasingly what happens in the periphery is what drives the core. So in the ascendant phase of the empire, in the expansionist phase, it's really the core which drives things. And to come back to your point earlier, Noe, that in ideas, and much of it is, of course, exported, and much of it is, a good deal of it, as you know, is also the importation and for re-export. I remember growing up in Canada, and the very first time an Indian friend invited me to dinner and said they were serving curry, I was surprised and said, "Do you eat curry as well?" Because I'd come to think of it as just being a British thing, growing up in a British family in Canada. And but increasingly, with the passage of time, what happens is the periphery develops. Eventually, more and more, what is happening in the core is dictated by events in the periphery. And I think, as we sort of, as Peter intimates in his comments, and as we do in the book, I think we're now going into that process where intellectually and ideas and culturally, increasingly, that is what is driving a lot of the ideas, the change that is taking place in the Western world. And I think that's causing some of the discomfort, the idea that, well, these are not our ideas. And what we're suggesting is many of them, in fact, are. Many of them are, themselves, the same way I sort of was born in a culture which had integrated curry into its menu, and contributed to a vast improvement in what was available in Britain. In the same way, many of these ideas that we think of as being foreign are actually themselves products of evolution within the periphery of what is the Western world. And as Peter says, the United States would like to now, I think, under Donald Trump at any rate, would like to check out of this Western world. But that doesn't mean the concept has lost its salience.
Absolutely. So when you are doing a quick flip through the book, so one of the things that comes up time and time again, and I'm going to stick to the Western thing because I think it's an important conversation at this point of time, for just one more question before I move on to the meat and potato of the conversation. The West today seems to be undergoing an existential transformation of what it stands for. So one of you is a professional historian, the other one is a professional economist. When you look at the idea of the West and the multiple transformations that it is taking under a lot of pressure, there's a lot of investigation into what does it mean to be Western at this point of time. You also refer time and time back to certain values that are taken for granted today. For example, democracy. Now, we see a subtle shift where the things that were taken to be Western ideals. So if I look at education or rather the participation of female into the workforce, it was something that the West gave away to the world. But more and more, you would see avenues opening up where some amount of traditional ideas are being brought into both economic and historical conversations, where the role of female in the workforce has to be limited, where certain things in the name of traditional Western values, it could be what you eat, it could be how many children you ought to have, it could be a whole lot of these particular identities. So how do we how do we look at the cultural and the economic differences of being the West? On the one side, the economic thing, as your book makes very clear, is this radical transformation that the OECD countries went through from 1945 to say 1970s. And then there was a cultural moment when Hollywood was the entertainment. I think 1999 is the year that the book starts with. But at the same time, more than the periphery, because that's one of the startling and perhaps one of the most original insights from the book, that the peripheries have become so rich, they have become so powerful that they can take on the West. But it's the West itself that is dismantling most of the progress that the West has made. So, how do we kind of, I would want both an economist and a historian to reflect on this, because this is just fascinating in more ways than one.
Peter, you want to go first?
All right, I'll reflect on it first. No, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's a great line of thought. As a historian, when I look at this, I see a lot of wishful thinking, actually, in the current emphasis on so-called traditional values. And I don't actually see a lot of practice in the sense that certain countries in the West, particularly say Hungary and to some extent more Christian elements within North America, are trying to reassert stay-at-home values and having more children. I mean, deliberately as an anti-immigration tactic, in more explicitly so. But if you actually look at the birth rates, they're not changing, in fact. And I don't see that one will ever go back to that. So there's a lot of talk around those kind of topics. I don't see a lot of substance. You know, Hungary has thrown a huge amount of policy initiatives that try to make people have more children, and a lot of money. And they've notched it up from 1.3 to 1.6 children per adult woman, which is still not enough to replace the population. You have to be at 2.1. They're nowhere close to it, and they've been trying at it for over a decade. That tells me as a historian it's not going to happen. So when I look at this, I see the kind of, I was going to say teething troubles, but it's kind of transition troubles as Western societies cope with the fact that they are no longer unchallengeable hegemons of the entire globe. You know, I'm British. I'm used to this transition. We've been dealing with this transition since about 1945, and you know, my dad was born in 1922 at the height of empire and blah blah blah. So you know, I saw it through his eyes, and I've seen it as a historian reflecting back on it. It's not easy. You buy into a value set and a worldview, and to realize that step by step and unseen, the world has changed around you, and that these values are actually anachronisms. That is really difficult. And to my mind, that's what we're seeing in certain more nationalist elements, both in North America and in Europe. It's that desperate desire to get back to something that has gone. It's actually gone. And if you look at the hard nuts and bolts of things like demographic patterns and patterns of wealth generation across the globe, it's over. You know, the tectonic plates have moved. This is a new world, and this is the world we need to think about. But you know, obviously for some people, and I'm not saying it, not for me either, to see the world change so fundamentally, well, that is threatening potentially. You've got a lot to think about. So that would be my reflection on it as a historian.
I think I would start with an analogy. If you look at the 2,000-year history of Christianity, but this would apply to other religions as well. But much of the world thinks of it as a European religion. But of course, it became a European religion, and it's now becoming, the real center of gravity of global Christianity is moving to the developing world. But of course, it starts out as a Mesopotamian religion, and there spreads long before it gets to most of Europe. It spreads into Africa. In other words, over time, the intellectual, cultural center of any kind of civilization will shift. And you can't say that Christianity, because it's become now a minority religion in the Middle East, is therefore no longer a significant religion. It is. It's just that and you can't say because it's declining in Europe, relatively speaking, that it's a declining religion. It's spread elsewhere. And if we translate that analogy into the whole question about the Western tradition, you take a simple illustration. I'm sitting here in South Africa at the moment, and I would say that last year, when South Africa took Israel to the International Court, I would say it was taking a stand in defense of the Western tradition that had been abandoned by a number of Western countries, and in particular the United States, in defense of universal rights. So I saw it really as a positive thing. And in many ways, and in the same way that I would say democracy is kind of under threat in countries like the US, in many developing countries, it's thriving. It's being altered. Now, when it comes to the re-export of culture, I think it just follows development. I mean, you take a country like Korea. I mean, there's just a larger market. And when your domestic market grows, eventually you become an exporter. You look at Korean movies from the 1950s, a time at which Korea was a desperately poor country, one of the poorest countries in the world. And essentially, two themes emerge. One is they mimic Hollywood filmmaking and do an inferior job. But the other thing is very much preoccupied with this idea that they're losing their culture. That the very fact of making this movie is making them into Americans or imitation Americans. But over time, as the Korean economy grew and it found its own hybrid model, that worked extraordinarily well. And the market itself grew. Now we have a situation where Korean culture is being exported around the world with a high degree of self-confidence. And I would say the same thing you could say with Indian films. That the Bollywood industry, which for the longest time, despite being the world's biggest industry, had almost an entirely domestic market, has increasingly found itself audiences in the wider world. And this will continue, but it is a reflection of that economic development that creates, it makes it possible not only to create more of the product, but to create a more sophisticated product, to add more production values, and to the point that you actually become globally competitive. Now, that might be an overly simplified way to see the world, but I tend to think, therefore, that as I'm optimistic, as is Peter. I still think that despite what is happening in the old core of the Western world, particularly in the United States, the assault on democracy, the assault on a lot of the traditions, and this attempt to sort of say, to come back to the very beginning of my analogy of Christianity, we have to go back to being a European religion. This is a European religion. Of course, what they're taking is a period of time and freezing it. J.D. Vance's conception of Christianity is very much a sort of early modern European idea. It is not Christianity as it is today. And I think what's happening is there is that crisis of confidence. And yet I do think in many ways the Western tradition is thriving. We can give it another name. It originated in the West, but it's something else. But I think it will outlast, even if the Western, even if some of the Western core goes into long-term decline. I think the tradition conceivably could last because it is being kept alive in many ways. As I use that illustration of South Africa and a number of other developing countries which supported its claims in defense of those very traditions associated at one time with the Western tradition.
That is actually very interesting because specifically because you brought up South Africa, and I was thinking about while I was reading the book and while also I was doing some research. Any book that I read also gives me some sort of, in the name of research, I can watch old drama, American drama that I particularly like. So there's this one thing called the West Wing. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to. So there's an episode in which the fictional American president quotes Roman history. I don't know if it is true or not because you are a Roman historian. I would not like to take that liberty based on an American show. But there's a very interesting analogy there, and that is that a Roman could walk to the end of the Roman Empire, stating something like civis Romana, that he's a Roman citizen or she is a Roman citizen, and any um, any harm caused to that particular Roman citizen would then be avenged by, say, the might of the Roman Empire. Now, this is in the context of the American power towards that time that you guys have written about in the book as being the apogee of the Western Empire, 1999, when everything was supposed to be good. And if we know something is that Mr. Clinton was no futurist. Two things that he proclaimed: the Chinese and the internet, and the good times ahead. They did not turn out as he intended. But while I was reading this book and while I was having this conversation, and I was trying to also think about it, I'm an Indian citizen. I was born in India. I was educated abroad. I was educated in Indian and British universities. In that way, I am very much a product of the Western culture and civilization to a certain extent. And so are a lot of people I know, not just in India, but in India, in China, in Japan. And we have no quarrel with the Western identity, the Western civilization project. It's just that we are often marginalized in this conversation, right? Because you have to. I've been employed by multilateral development banks in the past. When we think about and when we reflect about the economic processes that globalization was supposed to streamline and make everybody part of, a lot of the people that have contributed to this project are now being left behind. So, because you said in defense of the Western values, do you think in the process of writing this book and the 2 years that have gone by since this very timely book came out, the very concept of Western values have diverged from what they started out? Or let me rephrase it in one sentence, because Gibbon comes up quite a lot, the historian of, and I'm going to come to him at just after this. But do you think that a 19th century Britisher would have recognized the 1999 apogee of the Western Empire for what it was? Or were the values too divergent?
I think they would have struggled with the idea that they had become a middling power in 1999, whose role in world affairs was dictated by the new imperial center. I think this would have come as a shock to them. I mean, very forward-looking Britons at the end of the 19th century could have seen that they could see what was happening in the American economy and foreseen that they would one day translate this into military, diplomatic, and political dominance. But I think they would have struggled with the idea that England wouldn't still remain the center. And in truth, to this day, this is one of the fault lines in British politics, that there are still many British people, although they deny it, as being imperial nostalgia, really struggle with this idea. I mean, Brexit was in no small part driven by this idea that we could go alone in the world and be a great nation once again, rather than one whose fate is inexorably tied to other larger economies, like it or not. So I think foreseeing that kind of relative decline, I think, because from where they stood, this was the empire was approaching its peak. There'd been a big wave of expansion in the course of the 19th century. There was a lot of settlement. So I think, this just shows, I mean, nothing lasts forever. And I think this is now, we're in the early stages. I think what is happening today is the United States itself is perhaps going through what Britain would have gone through, and to some degree France would have gone through after the war, when they were forced to accept that they no longer were great imperial centers. And that's proving to be extraordinarily difficult. I don't think Americans of either political stripe want to accept this. But in terms of the marginalized voices, I think there's two things I would quickly just say about that. I think, first of all, is those voices are being heard more and more, which is part of what's causing the discomfort. And this pushback is, well, why are we listening to these people? They aren't Westerners. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, I think J.D. Vance, the American vice president's discomfort with Pope Francis, I think there is a sort of subtext to that Pope Francis is from Argentina. The kind of vision of the church he articulates, which didn't originate with him. It probably really originated quite a bit earlier, in some of the earlier popes and post-war popes, but very much more coming out of the culture of the developing world, and a very different approach to many of the issues that are not particularly European, if you will, is causing a lot of discomfort. So I think there is that real discomfort, but those voices, I think, are being heard. The other thing I would add is, I think sometimes we can overstate the degree to which there's a tendency to essentialize some of the discourse. Of, I wrote a book about neoliberalism, for example, and I wrote a book about development economics. So I've given a lot of thought to this. And one of the things I have to say is that there's a very popular on the left, and I come out of the leftist tradition, so I admit I was guilty of this, but to sort of say, well, neoliberalism came from the West, and there was this resistance, particularly things like dependency theory, that came from the developing world. But when I did the research in the book, I found an awful lot of the economists who were really developing and helping to sort of give a systematic coherence to neoliberal thought. Many of them were colleagues of mine in Cambridge, Indian economists, no small number of them, and some African economists as well. So this, in a sense, they were contributing to this particular narrative, and by the same token, some of the resistance to it was actually coming out of Western universities. So it's become a much more fluid marketplace of ideas, I think. And in that marketplace, I think what's causing the discomfort in Western countries on the right is that they're hearing a lot of voices that for a long time they didn't need to listen to, and it is uncomfortable because it is challenging them, just as the Pope challenges J.D. Vance's view of what the church should be. Peter,
yes, Yeah, I totally agree with what John said. I'd just add a couple of additional thoughts. I mean, one is, I'm a medieval bloody historian. My time frame is millennia. And so, things take a long time. The Industrial Revolution took a long time. The adjustment to loss of empire takes a long time. When you're that's very little comfort to people who are caught in the middle of it and are not benefiting from changes. But I don't think it should surprise us that, as it were, the sort of imperialist Western tradition is not going easily. That really should not be any kind of a shock. I mean, if you look at, if you really add up how many wars even the Dutch as well as the French and the British were willing to fight after World War II to try and hold on to bits of odd territory, then, you see that. So I don't think it should surprise us that there's a very strong cast in America that's not ready to kind of smell the coffee yet. So, it takes a long time. Even though the fundamentals have changed, it takes a long time for the consequences to work themselves out. The other point I would make is to separate power from the broader Western tradition and make the point that the Western tradition has always been contested, in the sense that it's always about other voices. When you ask the question, would Britishers from 100 years ago recognize 1999 West? Well, actually, if you go back to where we were in 1899, within Britain, you've got women fighting for the vote, and you've got working class just about getting organized enough to have their own political party. So you've got subaltern voices within the West demanding fair and equal shares. I mean, the best thing that I see in the Western tradition is a willingness, in the end, being dragged kicking and screaming, no doubt, for broader consensus around the idea that everyone has a right to a voice and everyone has a right to equal treatment under the law. That's what I see as the best things. But those are never easily granted or gently ceded away. It's always which voices, and as more voices learn to articulate themselves and mobilize themselves, then more voices are coming into the conversation. And you get the demand for this kind of basic, reasonable treatment extending to different groups, social groups, ethnic groups, whatever groups. But it's always contested. So again, that's the second thought I have. So it takes a long time for these kinds of things to work their way through, and it's never a piece of cake. But it'll happen. I think it will happen.
No, absolutely. I hope they do. But that brings me to the historical question, because you have a wonderful quote in the introduction where you kind of get into the article that Neil Ferguson had written around
Yes.
2015, I think, if I'm not wrong.
Yes,
But
that's right.
I went looking a bit back because I remembered a very interesting piece of history that was written by the journalist David Halberstam in his book, The Next Century, that was about the Soviet Empire. And perhaps we will get to the Soviet Empire also, because fascinating empire that I would want your reflections on. But there is a quote that I'm going to read from the last essay, I think, that Mr. Halberstam wrote for Vanity Fair. And this is about George Bush. I clearly am obsessed with Republican American presidents for some reason. So, ironically, it is the president himself, a man notoriously careless about, indeed almost indifferent to, the intellectual underpinnings of his actions, who's come to trumpet loudest his close scrutiny of the lessons of the past. Though before he tended to boast about making critical decisions based on instinct and religious faith, he now talks more and more about historical mandates. Usually, he does this in the broadest and vaguest sense. History teaches us, we know from history, history shows us. In one of his speaking appearances in March 2006 in Cleveland, Ohio, I counted 4 references to history and what it meant for today, as if he had dinner the night before with Arnold Toynbee, or at the very least Barbara Tushman, and then gone home for a few hours to read his Gibbon. So, one, it gets Gibbon into the picture, a historian that also features in this book. It's very interesting because now in 2025, there are 2 takeaways. One, that everybody is a historian, especially on Twitter. Everybody has got a solid training in history. They understand the evidence, they understand the archives, they've seen it. They know everything about the historical process. And second, we now have more and more, for lack of a better word, I think I'll have to use statesman. I would refer you to the infamous interview that Vladimir Putin had, where he went sort of a long sweeping history lesson on Russia. And we tend to get that quite a lot in the American politics as well. If you look at Mr. Musk, who is very powerful in this current dispensation, he and his civilizational industries that he wants to save, the demographic collapse, so on and so forth. The, the main cardinal point of the book is that the historical processes are not swift, but they are definite. And the internal decay is not as much as a problem as the periphery and the strong arming of the periphery, or rather the strong arming that periphery can do to the larger empires. If everybody is this dedicated to history, and if we have all the lessons of history available and the evidence available and all of these great technocrats at hand to solve this, why are you not hopeful about the chances of the West versus the rest?
But I guess I would say I'm hopeful for the West. But the idea that
would it be? May I just? Sorry. Would it be the West as we have come to see it, or would it be a West of, say, 500 years ago?
Well, yeah, I think what we argue against in the book is this very conception that you have the West and the rest as being discrete entities. And what we're saying, of course, is they're intimately connected throughout their whole. There is no West without the rest, without that exploitation of the colonial periphery. But in the same process, you get the development of the periphery. And I think the major fault that those who propound this sort of civilizational narrative, going back to Huntington, but certainly Musk, Trump, Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage, there's a long list of them, is they assume that the West rose separate from the rest, and the rest are just coming, to take it now. And that there is this complete discrete separation. Musk would be an interesting case study. Many have tried him because, of course, he is South African, grew up in apartheid South Africa. And there are those who say that really what he is nostalgic. What he's really trying to do is recreate apartheid, that he's really troubled by the fall and that you read his text that way. Now, I'm not going to allege that. I don't know him. And I frankly don't pay enough attention to him to really want to sort of discern his psychology, but many people have tried. And I do think there is this kind of what in South Africa we would call the lager mentality, a sort of kind of getting behind the barricades and defending yourself, which was most beautifully captured, I think, in a book by a South African novelist who won the Nobel Prize. A book, J.M. Coetzee wrote a book called Waiting for the Barbarians. And the striking thing about that, it was an analogy not just of South Africa, but of imperialism. And of course, the whole point, in a sense, that Coetzee is making in this book, not the whole point, but a point that comes across is by the end of the book, you're not sure who the barbarians are. That in fact, there's so much evil is being perpetrated in defense of civilization that the real barbarism is not actually being carried out by those they are calling. And that's what we have seen and are seeing. And that is the kind of, so, you annihilate Gaza and you turn it into a beach resort, as Trump would like to do. And you somehow say this is creating a superior civilization. And of course, most of humanity begs to differ. So I think they have a fundamentally flawed understanding of what the West is and how it came to be. Wouldn't you say, Peter?
Absolutely. The sort of light bulb moment when we were doing the book, and it's a sign of my own limited brain power. It took me that long to get to it. Is to realize that empires aren't things; they are systems with moving parts, and the empire is not just the center that is benefiting primarily at any one particular moment. It's all the other moving parts that are involved in the system, and it was a system of transferring wealth and value and human beings from a periphery, as it then was, to the center. But in doing that, it actually developed the periphery to such an extent that the system ceases to work in the way that it used to do. And the center, what was the center, can no longer transfer wealth and value with the same kind of ease as it used to do. And this is the sort of inescapable mutual transformation that I think we understand to be at the heart of what's going on in the world around us. And we wanted on the cover a MAGA hat upside down. Actually, that's what we wanted. You cannot do this. You can't turn the clock back to the 1950s and the 1960s. America will never be the center of industrial production for the world again. It might become the center of production for itself. You could make that happen, but you will never be able to make a situation where America is dominating industrial production for everywhere on the planet. That just can't and won't happen anymore.
So this kind of opens up the avenue for me to get into the economics of it a bit, because that's a very interesting argument that both of you make at the start itself, and then it kind of gets reiterated throughout the book. You both argue that the strategic blocks that made the fulcrum of the greatness, be it Brexit or Make America Great Again, they're not just possible anymore. But for a lot of people, this idea that there is some sort of we can just turn the clock round, we can go back to that one particular time. So if you create tariff walls, if you create tax structures, then industries are just going to flow over to the West. It could be the United States, it could be Germany, it could be England, so on and so forth. When the first presidency happened, there was a lot of resistance to this idea. People were openly arguing against it. In the last 3 or 4 months, so we have the return of a president on a very razor-thin majority. Most of the Americans are not behind him. However, this feels like a victory lap. The kind of statements that are coming out, the kind of rhetoric that is being put out, you would imagine that some sort of an economic miracle is just round the bend, that we're just going to get it. So, and I was fascinated, thinking about it, and I thought that I'm going to open this to both of you. What prompts, say, a large economic bloc like the EU suddenly changing a lot of their policies, a lot of their economic thinking, which has taken a long time to be shaped up? Suddenly, we see that there's a lot of change in how they would want to engage with the Americans. We see the Americans doing almost a triumphant march, that somehow the economic hegemony that existed for the United States from 1945, at least till the oil shock, is back. But if you look at the numbers, the United States constantly fares bad when it comes to health indicators, education indicators, and just about every other indicator. If you were to change the statistics, it'll be very hard to find out if you're talking about a world superpower or one of the lowest ranking countries in the World Bank category. So what has changed this time around? What really has changed this Pax Trumpana, if that is a word? I could.
Well, let me go first, since you addressed the economics specifically. I don't think much. An awful lot of the rhetoric has changed. And Donald Trump's, fundamentally, nothing has changed. There's an awful lot of surface activity. But the fact is, first off, there's a lot of talk about what countries will do to sort of please America. You illustration, one of my countries, I say I grew up in Canada. Canada was threatened with 25% tariffs. And they responded rather forcefully, but also said, okay, well, we're going to boost border patrols and appoint a fentanyl czar. And so Trump got his victory lap on the basis of this. Well, it very quickly transpired that the boosting on the border was something that had been already planned a month before and actually announced in Canada. So he was basically, the Prime Minister of Canada was just serving him a warmed over dish. It's like sticking a policy in the microwave and saying, I cooked this for you. And a fentanyl czar, fine. You just create, someone you give him a title but that's the end of it. There's not really much change. By the same token, I think we're seeing a lot of pledges. We're going to invest in America, but until I actually see those pledges materialize, I'm not going to lend too much credence to them. My own view is that, and in the meantime, if you look at what's happening in the economy, investment is slowing rather sharply in America, largely because of all the uncertainty that's being created, because it's not even clear if he's going to follow through on these tariff threats. What everyone wants to make of it, it's good drama. It might look like good politics. It's pretty dreadful economic policy. And I would feel pretty confident predicting that within a year, the US economy is going to be in a recession. And there could be quite a sharp market correction. And that Donald Trump is frankly going to have bigger problems to deal with. And we have to bear in mind that next year there are the midterm elections in the US. If he loses the House of Representatives, which ordinarily one could expect to do because the incumbent party loses seats in midterm elections, and there's such a slender margin that Republicans are very likely to lose the House of Representatives. And if, as you point out, given that he doesn't have a strong mandate, his approval ratings have been falling rather sharply already, it may well be that they lose quite substantially. And that essentially means that Donald Trump presidency he's a lame duck president. He can't do anything domestically. He can make an awful lot of noise and he can do a lot of damage. But most of that damage, I think, is being done domestically. I think the way other countries respond now, if they're clever, the leaders of other countries, particularly in Europe, are going to sort of band together and come up with common positions, and also respond forcefully. As I say, Canada, which is a much smaller country, but yet it came back with tariff threats of its own, and that seemed to be as much as anything else what moved Trump to back down and say, "Well, I'm going to wait until March." And I'd be willing to bet that come March, he's going to give another month, and this will keep going on indefinitely. I think there's an awful lot of bluster. It goes down well with his audience, but it's not fundamentally, I think, changing the global picture. But I do think it's doing damage to the American economy.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. None of the fundamentals are changing. He's not getting rid of American debt. He's probably going to add to it. The rumors are this huge tax cut is coming for very rich people. Most people voted for him to lower the price of gas, and that's not what's going to happen.
And eggs.
Eggs, which are record highs.
Then there will be trouble. And, unless he can change the constitution, he'll be a lame duck in 2 years anyway, because he can't be re-elected. And the succession bloodletting amongst the Republicans is going to be intense. So, whether they lose the House of Representatives or not, unless he can get a 2/3 majority in the Senate to change the Constitution and allow him to run for a third term, which I'm sure he wants to, but I strongly suspect he can't get, then he's gone in 2 years. So, as John says, no doubt he'll keep rabbiting away about how important he is and how great he is until he finally ends up in the grave, as we all must do. I'm sure we'll hear about him forever, but the amount that he can actually do, I think, is really small. I mean, that's the point. I realize that as a historian, I just have never bought the great man's school of history, and I don't buy it now. There's a lot of noise going on, but the numbers are not changing. The structures are not changing. And you can't change those structures in 2 years, especially if you don't really have the levers to do it. And I'm sure we will see an awful lot of people making noises that Trump wants to hear in order to get, favors from him, because he's very arbitrary. There's not a consistent policy here. This is, are you reflecting my greatness back at me? If you are, I'll give you a favor. That's the way this regime is working in practice, and I'm sure it's the way it will continue to work. So you'll see a lot of that, but it won't change the numbers and it won't change the structures.
As we're about to hit the 1 hour mark, I'm going to ask you 2 short questions, and then then perhaps we could conclude and get back. We could do a sort of a 2-year monitoring of the Trump midterms, perhaps.
I do hope in 2 years' time we might have just stopped talking about them quite so much. It would be great.
Well, we can definitely hope that. But here's the thing: reading your book, the one thing that comes up quite often is the administrative complexity. You know, the level of complexity that makes the the empire in question resistance to change, or rather not really able to respond to how situation is changing around it. We find that the administrative complexity in the world that we live in today is just going up. You know, you have more and more regulations coming up. Most of these regulations are sort of, they have a point of origin. Mostly, I feel that it's the European Union, and then they get kind of talked about and then taken up in toto in different parts of the world. But one of the fascinating things that has happened in the last 5 years, especially around the COVID time, that regulations have more and more come under attack. So the example I'll give you is the Indian example. So we have the labor code. A lot of Indian states, in order to attract investments from China, because if you have to be hyper competitive, then you have to have you can't. So in the Indian code you have the ability to unionize. So the ability to unionize was taken away, so on and so forth. And then the wage rate, etc., became competitive instead of a fixed wage rate that, say, instead of the market, the government used to decide. Now, in the past 3 4 months, we have seen in the world's largest democracy and exporter of democracy, the United States, a lot of change when it comes to how regulations are looked at. The latest case in point being the US aid. So this entire operation has just been stopped, stripped off. There is, if you look at in the African continent, in parts of South Asia, HIV medicines were one of the biggest, let's say, donor dependencies of USAID. So that's not available anymore. In your analysis of empire or post-empire, uh, have you ever seen the context for such rash decision making? Are there historical references to this that we can go back and draw upon in the Roman history? Because I actually tried finding it, but it was a long process. Never was so much destruction wrought by the whims and fancies of a few important people in such a short period of time.
I would say, and then I'm going to hand over to Peter for the historical analogy. I do think COVID-19 is going to be revealed to have been a turning point historically, or perhaps not a turning point, but an accelerant, that a process underway, particular relative decline of the West, gets moved into sort of a much more accelerated, and politics in Western countries becomes quite a lot more fraught. What I'm still thinking this through, because it's, as Peter says, as a historian, he has the luxury of reflecting on things that happened 1,000 years ago, and I'm trying to make sense of things that happened earlier this morning, and it's not always easy. And with COVID-19, I think it's still too early to say. Although I think about it constantly. I'm actually, writing my next book. Will be, bringing that into the discussion. I think it's a turning point. But what analogies from history, Peter, do you have any that come to mind?
Well, I think where it's different, you see, is that pre-modern states have such a small revenue stream coming in that the range of things that they fund is so small. They don't run healthcare systems, they don't run pensions, they don't run social care. No one thought they should, because they couldn't. The amount of surplus that a pre-modern, largely agricultural economy generates means that you have a totally different state form. And all a state form does is actually, in the pre-modern world, is do military capacity and a bit of patronage to small, politically important elites. Again, it's one of those things that dawned on me eventually, that this is sort of big difference. I mean, So you can't wreak such broad-ranging havoc with your revenue decisions in the pre-modern world. But certainly you can see some very short-termist things. So there's one Roman emperor who really likes to say to his taxpayers that he's tough on barbarians and tough on the causes of barbarism. And he stages attacks on people who are perfectly willing to have fairly reasonable and peaceful and quiet relations with him on the frontier, and causes trouble. So he unilaterally lowers the value of diplomatic gifts that he hands over to them. They use those gifts to sustain their own power in their own territories. So when those gifts come in and they're not very good anymore, people start to lose face within their own societies, and you get a period of dramatic frontier turbulence. I mean, that's about the closest thing I can see. And it's reflecting the more limited reach of pre-modern states. But yes, arbitrary, autocratic power is always capable of being really stupid. And it's always stupid for a reason. And in a sense, it's the same reason. This is the emperor I've got in mind, it's called Valentinian I, who reigns between 364 and 373. And he's got his base in mind, who don't like barbarians. So he's playing to his base. And the fact that this generates more trouble on the frontier than if he hadn't done it probably doesn't worry him that much. And I think that's the same with what we're seeing with Trump. But of course, again, we don't know how many of these, I mean, the damage that these maneuvers undertakes has already caused is substantial, and they'll carry on causing damage. But we don't know how many of these will actually stay, because they're all illegal under the American Constitution. So, that's there's a lot of argument to be played out before we see what the end game is, even with those things.
So this brings me to, I said two, but I have just thought about climate change. And I think climate change is the work, or rather the project that you're working on. If I remember correctly from one of your appearances on fascinating conversation in Novara.
Oh, yes.
And that is the thing that I've been thinking about for some time. Because climate change is already reorienting the system that we live in. And climate change in the past has been one of the biggest regime changer in the history. However, with all of the technology that we've got and all of the information that we've got, we have a lot of resistance to the fact that there is a climate change happening or not. How does the current international system respond to this when you have a lot of internal pressure on how exactly should this particular thing be responded to in terms of market, in terms of capitals? I mean, you have large companies that were going gaga over the ESG 2 years ago, and suddenly ESG is no longer a kosher term. So large American companies are, to power AI revolutions, Microsoft and Facebook are buying mini nuclear reactors. And if corporate history is anything to go by, it's something that we should definitely be scared about, because, these technologies in corporate hands have never really ended well. Just ask people in India in the East India Trading Company.
Yeah.
So,
we did discuss climate change.
Go ahead, John. No, you first.
Okay. We did discuss climate change when writing the book, and we realized, because in a sense it changes everything. Everything we're saying is irrelevant if there's climate collapse, then all civilization collapses, and this is a very real possibility. But we also realize that it's a book on its own, and we couldn't really entertain at length. What we did say is, of course, this is the very reason why it's very important for countries not to turn on themselves, because it will require an international solution. Having said that, and this will be in my next book, what I'm writing, I think Western countries, the attempt, and we do say this in the book, that the very attempt to make yourself great again is going to backfire and potentially turn relative decline into absolute decline. I mentioned early in the discussion, I believe, I'm confident, in fact, that the United States economy will be in recession in a year. And regardless of what Donald Trump says, if there's a recession, carbon emissions go down. In a sense, he might want to drill, baby drill, but there's not going to be much drilling going on at all at that point. And beyond the statements of companies, what is very interesting is, so these fund managers who are saying they're chucking ESG. There's a very interesting report a couple of days ago in the Financial Times, which said the long-term investors who actually invest the money in these fund managers like BlackRock are rebelling against this and saying, well, maybe you don't have to think about long-term returns, but I run a pension fund and I have contributors who are going to only begin to draw on that pension in 40 years' time. I'm very much concerned about the future. I'm not just concerned about the quarterly statement. So, and I think, as far as the, some of the Silicon Valley tech oligarchs of, they're so eager to line up behind Trump because they see there's commercial opportunity in doing so and commercial costs in not doing so. But a lot of companies are remaining silent, principally because they do remain committed. And in the electrical, in the power generating sector in the United States, there's a real concern that if Trump were to succeed in sort of reversing the energy transition that was sort of starting finally to pick up speed under Biden, there's going to be a crisis because they're simply not able to generate enough electricity unless they build out a lot of these renewables, because it is also the cheapest source of energy available now. So I think the economics, this is yet another example I'll use, is that I would liken it to King Canute, the difference being that King Canute trying to beat back the waves, he was actually making a point to courtiers who were saying, you can do anything. And he said, okay, let's go see, I'll try and beat back the waves. But I think Trump really is convinced he can beat back the waves by the force of will, and the waves are going to overwhelm him.
That's a very interesting. I really hope that happens, because the world is very bleak without that.
Yeah.
My last question to both of you is the role of the financial systems. Going through the book, one of the things I felt that the financial systems as they exist right now, say in China, in India, other parts of the world, they're very codependent. I mean, the Chinese market invests quite heavily in the Indian market. The Indian companies are very heavily invested in the American market. So you can't really take away the financial imperative of being joined. Yet the first people to get onto the bandwagon of isolationism are the people from the financial markets. I mean, if you look at the backers of Brexit, if you look at the first Trump presidency, the Mercer family that had really contributed to that particular. So, I mean, instinctively, what I wanted to understand was the historical processes that shape a good financial year. They require integration. But what changes? I mean, I know it's a large question, but what changes, and how do these? Where do these voices come from? That perhaps the best thing to do is if we all go back to that time when we were behind the wall.
So I think it's very important when we talk about the financial sector is not to treat it as an amorphous whole. In the Brexit vote, there was an actual division within the financial sector. And I think you can say the same thing about the backers of Trump. A lot of the banks are not necessarily very comfortable with what's happening. And certainly in Britain, I don't think the banks were at all comfortable. The city, as it's known, the financial district in London, has really not done well off Brexit. It knew it wasn't going to do well off Brexit. It's lost a lot of business to Europe. But some hedge funds which happened to be exposed to sectors which actually benefited from, for example, from the very damage that Brexit does. And it's important to remember this. This is something, I've lived and worked most of my professional life in developing countries, and I've always been fascinated with development. And one of the things that I learned early on in my career is that there's money to be made in decline. In other words, that you can have an anti-growth. When Liz Truss came up with this idea of a anti-growth coalition, it wasn't original. She was completely misusing it. I'd written about anti-growth coalitions 20 years earlier because I'd come across this in developing countries, because at one time I ran a development think tank, and I was encountering, and going with the usual standard economic pitch. If we grow the economy, everyone benefits. You'll have more business. But in fact, there are people who make their money off crisis, off declining. I mean, starting with the fact that the security companies weren't that thrilled with the idea that the police would be better resourced and, there'd be less crime. They were actually making a lot of money off the crime. In the same way, when you actually have a civil war, very often you have economic interests who are contributing to fighting factions, because you create a scarcity premium, and the traders controlling parts of the market actually make rents off that and make a lot more money. So I think the crashing of the fall in the pound, for example, and certain forms of arbitrage, certain forms of business which are involved in customs processing, there were interests that stood to gain from economic decline in Britain, and they were driving that. And I think you see the same thing. A lot of the backers of Trump, I would hesitate to say the financial sector as a whole likes it. In fact, if you look at the profile of corporate donations to the political campaigns of Donald Trump in the past, he did not do terribly well in the sort of the commanding heights of the economy. And since his election, it's really in, I would say, the tech sector and really among the tech oligarchs. I think in the startup ecosystem in Silicon Valley, they're still pretty democratic. But Elon Musk stands to make a lot of money from government contracts. And I think people like Jeff Bezos and, Mark Zuckerberg are hoping to get in on that same gravy train. And so they're willing to put a lot of money and line up behind them. I'm not sure you're going to find that's actually a sentiment shared widely in the American corporate sector. I may be wrong, but I don't think I am.
It's always fascinated me the way that the big players in America donate to both presidential campaigns.
Yeah.
They are hedging.
Yeah.
They've got plan A and they've got plan B. And I think also the other thing, of course, is to remember that a lot of these people are not interested in the economy. They're interested in their own profit. Musk is that in spades. He doesn't give a damn whether the average American is doing fine. That's not why he's there. He's there to make a very great sum of money, which he already has by all accounts. So yeah. It's kind of, what capitalists want is monopoly, because that's what they make most money out of, as kind of John was implying. If you know what's going to happen, that's where knowledge is power, and you can then manipulate what you do in understanding what the trend is going to be and make a huge sum of money out of it. You don't care what the broader pattern is for poor suckers like us who are caught in the middle of it.
Francis Bacon of the knowledge is power fame would have been right at home in today's world, especially in the Trump presidency. And that's not really saying a lot for where we have ended up. But it's been a fascinating hour. Thank you so much for doing this. And for the people who are going to be watching it and listening to it later, the book Why Empires Fall is available wherever you get your book. Please go and read it, because it's a very slim book, but has a lot of insights. And thank you so much for writing it.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, a pleasure.
Thank you.